and welcome to the latest episode of People, Politics, and Prose, FPRI's conversations with authors about their works, their careers, and the ideas that drive them. I'm Ron Granieri, and Senior Fellow at FPRI. All of us from FPRI welcome you and thank you for joining us live on Zoom and recorded on the FPRI YouTube page. History is not simply the dry recitation of past deeds and events. Good history is built on the assiduous selection and organization of the facts, on the narrative skill of the historian, and on the whiff of theatricality that makes for an unforgettable lecture. Walter McDougall is a master of all of these tasks. For decades, in books, articles, and spellbinding lectures, Professor McDougall has helped students and audiences of all ages better understand the people and forces that have shaped the history of the United States and its role in the world. With his keen eye for the telling anecdote and his unerring understanding of the big picture, McDougall has taken readers from the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles to the Bering Strait, from Independence Hall to the moon. He helped us to understand the role of the hustler in building the United States of America and the baleful influence of Woodrow Wilson's moralizing spirit on American foreign policy. In his latest book, Gems of American History, The Lecturer's Art, a collection of 12 essays/lectures on a range of topics, McDougall examines some of the most pivotal events and figures of American history, dissecting with skill and wit how this extraordinary republic came to be and what is required to preserve its legacy of liberty. So what does it mean to understand American history, or any history for that matter? What makes a good historian? How should Americans, especially, understand their relationship to the past? These questions, and yours, will guide us in our conversation with Walter McDougall. Walter A. McDougall is the kind of guy that you would say deserves no introduction or needs no introduction, especially to an audience from FPRI, but it is a pleasure to introduce him nonetheless. He is the chairman of FPRI's Board of Advisors and sits on the board of editors of FPRI's journal Orbis. He is the Alloy Anson Professor of International Relations and Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania. His many honors include a Pulitzer Prize, election to the Society of American Historians, and appointment to the Library of Congress Council of Scholars. His articles and columns have appeared in many major national publications, and his books have covered topics from France's Rhineland diplomacy to the political history of the space age and to the history of the North Pacific, as well as a 2-volume history of the United States from discovery to the Gilded Age. Most of all, he is known for 2 path-breaking books on the history of American diplomacy, Promised Land, Crusader State, and The Tragedy of U.S. Foreign Policy, How American Civil Religion Betrayed the National Interest. Across a broad career full of insight and creativity, Walter McDougall is one of the greatest historians of his generation, and he is an inspiration to students and colleagues alike, including your humble host. It's a great pleasure to welcome him to People, Politics, and Prose. Welcome, Walter.
Thank you very much, Ron. Let me tell your audience the kind words you said about my lecture style and classroom performance, very much appreciated. But one of the most astounding lecturers that I have ever heard, it was my former colleague, Professor Ron Granieri. Oh. Because I'm insecure, and so I diligently prepare all my lectures, and I actually write them out as if it were a script. Yeah. And then I read them from the podium. But I don't just read. I don't just stare at the page. I project to the audience. I keep eye contact. I emote, and I've mastered that skill over the years. By having an absolute perfect written out text, but delivering it as if it were extemporaneous. Granieri lectures without any notes at all. It's amazing.
I'm just too lazy to write anything down, Walter. That's the problem.
Anyway, you were legendary.
Well, thank you. That's awfully nice of you to say. Now everybody can understand why I invited you on the program. But So I want to talk about the book. I want to talk about your career, right? There's a bunch of different angles, but I want to start with the genesis of this particular collection, right? What led to your decision to take, these are mostly more recent lectures that you've given, but to collect them in this particular volume. What was the initial impulse to do so?
Old age. I'm beyond. I'm 78 years old. I'm still teaching full time.
Yeah.
But I don't have the energy anymore to travel to archives and Europe and Washington and write long research books. And so I thought to myself, well, I'd like to keep publishing. What can I put out that wouldn't require long research trips? And it occurred to me from the FPRI website, in fact, that I have dozens and dozens of lectures which I've written over the years and delivered mostly for FPRI audiences.
Yeah.
And the texts of many of those lectures are posted on the FPRI website. And so I thought to myself, why not just put out an anthology of my most dramatic and sterling lectures that I've delivered over the decades? And I knew that there had needed to be, I don't know what, an overlapping theme of some sort that tied all the articles together. So I decided to confine myself to lectures on American history. I've also delivered many on European and Asia Pacific history, but I decided that for this volume that I would put together a compendium of articles on themes of American history that kind of overlap in one respect or another. They complement each other like, if you will, gems in an elaborate necklace or bracelet. And I was very fortunate. I found out when I was peddling the book to various publishers, that publishers are not interested anymore in anthologies. Many even academic publishers like Yale or Penn don't even look at your manuscript.
Yeah.
And so I thought to myself, well, maybe I'm out of luck. But then I found some wonderful people at the Institute for the Intercollegiate Studies Institute down in Wilmington, Delaware, who were very interested. They read the manuscript, they read the articles, and they thought that, gee, these are gems. We've really got to put them out. Unfortunately, ISI was this is about 2.5, 3 years ago. ISI was itself getting out of the business of publishing books.
Right.
They've published some great books over the years, but now they were getting out of the business. But they did establish a relationship with Encounter Books, and so the ISI people kind of served as agents for me and go-betweens with Encounter Books, and they put out the book this year, and you've already shown it. But the production values are wonderful. It's a beautiful book. Very well done.
Well, and it's interesting you say that, right? That we don't do collections anymore. The publishers don't, because on the one hand, I'm sure they say, well, articles can be found on the internet, but that would be like they used to say, well, anybody could find scholarly articles by going to the library and pulling down the bound periodicals or the old newspapers. But to actually one of the best ways to celebrate a scholar's career is to bring together pieces that, sure, somebody could find someplace else, but they don't have to go looking for them someplace else because they're all right here. And so the decision to go with American history, I was thinking about this because I know that you of course started out your career writing about France's Rhineland diplomacy and teaching European diplomacy, and you've taught we both taught those courses at Penn, 420 and 421 on European diplomacy. Would you ever be inspired to collect those lectures? Because I have this image, the way you described that you've written all your lectures out. I have this image that somewhere there's a file drawer where we have every lecture McDougall's ever given. Is this true?
Well, you anticipate me. Because this is, by the way, my 11th book.
11th book. Yeah,
Yep.
that's true. Yeah. For those who keep score at home.
I intend to publish a 12th book. I would love to do it again with Encounter, which would be a companion to this book, Gems of European History, The Lecturer's Art, Part 2.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'll make sure, I hope they're listening. I hope they're watching this, because I think that's an excellent idea.
For instance, one of the oldest articles or lectures that I ever delivered at Penn, I believe I delivered it my very first year here, which would be 1988. I had just moved from the University of California at Berkeley to take up the chair at Penn. And I had, of course, had achieved a certain notoriety, if you will, or fame for the Space book, which won the Pulitzer Prize,
right?
The Soviet-American space race. And so the History of Science department here at Penn asked if I would be interested in giving a lecture to their students and their guests. And for somehow, I can't really remember why I came up with this, but I had the idea of delivering a lecture on Jules Verne. Yes, the 19th century French novelist, who was one of the pioneers, perhaps the principal pioneer of what we would call science fiction.
For sure. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, master of the world, right?
From the Earth to the Moon and so forth. And so I did a lot of research for that lecture, because I had to bone up on his biography, and put together this wonderful lecture, which really was a success. Everybody loved it, and then I filed it away and assumed I would never use it again. But this next book, the one on European history, would be a perfect opportunity to pull that lecture out.
Absolutely.
And mix in some cultural and intellectual history along with the political narrative.
Well, because I think, for obviously we should talk about the work at hand and not work people haven't read. But if they haven't read your essays on Venice, for example, based on your recent visits to Italy, this is definitely something that needs to be brought out.
The Venice article lecture was another labor of love.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All my books, except for that first one you showed, which was based on my doctoral dissertation,
right?
But all the other books that I've written have, in one way or another, been labors of love.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's a very powerful motivator.
Yeah.
The Verne lecture. My other lectures, whether it's European, American, or Pacific history. Mm-hmm. The book, my book on the Pacific, is this big fat volume called "Let the Sea Make a Noise," which is a quotation from one of the Psalms in the Bible. A history of the North Pacific from Magellan to MacArthur. I wrote that book soon after I arrived at Penn. And was motivated to do it as a kind of a long, wistful farewell to the Pacific Ocean. Mm-hmm. I'd lived for 13 years in Northern California, teaching at Berkeley. Of course, there's a lot to love about Northern California, especially back in the day. And I met my wife there. Mm-hmm. And so I had this sense that I had left Berkeley, but I could use this book as a way of not entirely leaving the North Pacific Ocean. My wife and I honeymooned on Hawaii. I was asked to be a guest lecturer on a cruise to Alaska. A few years after I came to Penn, and my wife and I took this wonderful cruise for free. Up through the Inland Passage to Anchorage, through Juneau and Ketchikan and all, and I also went to Taiwan with a delegation from the FPRI back in the 90s. So I had occasions to go back to the North Pacific Ocean several times, and of course doing research for this book. So that too was a labor of love.
Well, and what I'm fascinated by is, you haven't shied away from big topics and big ideas, and you haven't shied away from, you have an ability, I would say, to take a big idea, and to show everybody how big it is without being afraid of it. Like you talk about the history of the space age, but you don't start with Sputnik. Right, you go further back, right, to the very beginnings of human flight, and the idea of writing a book about the largest, most intimidating body of water on Earth, creates it's a pretty large and intimidating topic. And I remember when I started, when I came to the University of Pennsylvania 22 years ago, and was in your office, and we were talking about things, and you asked me if I was familiar with Nootka Sound, right? We had a discussion about these conflicts in the 18th century,
1790.
Yes, thank you. And just that sense of being willing to view the entire world, and being able to view across centuries. Like even when you write a history of the United States of America and you started in 1528, right? That you're not afraid to deal with big topics across broad ranges to show this kind of knowledge. So much of the history profession is about specialization. And how do you consciously try to defy the notions of specialization, or is this something that is that's just kind of happened?
I was extremely fortunate, blessed really, because it was totally accidental. To enter the University of Chicago, the graduate program in history, at a time when the history department at Chicago was led, among other people, by William Hardy McNeill.
Mm-hmm.
William H. McNeill was certainly one of the two or three greatest American historians of his generation. And to work under McNeill was an absolute thrill. And among the kind of career-defining traits that I learned from McNeill was precisely to be a generalist.
Mm-hmm.
McNeill wrote a history of the world in one volume. He told me once, McDougall, I had decided to, and this was early in his career, he was probably in his upper 30s. He said, I intended to write a history of the human race in one volume in less than 1,000 pages. So he was an absolute master, not only of generalization, but of synthesis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And he went on to write, I don't know what, a couple of dozen books, all of which are very insightful and very brilliant, and always relevant to a very large theme. And so I was not going to work with McNeill. I had taken a seminar from him, but I had another professor who was expert in my more narrow field of 20th century Central Europe. Is a wonderful man who wrote a book on Weimar policy, Weimar German policy, and the Czech Republic,
Mm-hmm.
and the new country of Czechoslovakia that emerged out of the Treaty of Versailles, and I was going to be working on France's Rhineland diplomacy, the French policy toward Germany after the Treaty of Versailles. And so he was the natural person to serve as my Doktorvater, or
Right,
as we say in German, my mentor. But his name was Greg Campbell.
mm-hmm.
And Greg Campbell, as I was just about to start my dissertation, took me aside and said, Walter, I think you should work with William McNeill. He said, I'm a young historian. I'm not even sure I'm going to get tenure. In the end, he didn't.
Mm.
And I won't really be able to help your career. But if you turn out to be a McNeill student and have his firepower writing letters of recommendations and supporting you in your career, you may go far. And so, thanks to that very good advice, I worked with McNeill. William McNeill was an absolute prince of a teacher and a professor and as a role model. Mm-hmm. When I went to Paris to do my research for the dissertation, McNeill told me before I left, write me a letter every month. No, there was no email back then. Write me a letter every month telling me of your progress and what you found in the archives, what problems you've confronted, and how your views of your subject have developed over the last month. Well, that was a chore. I had to carry a typewriter on airplanes and all around Paris just to write these letters. But I did what he advised, and every month my letter back to McNeill would be more and more introspective and thought-provoking. I really did think about the history that I was studying, and I crafted my thoughts, and I wrote him these long letters. He always wrote back. Almost the same day that he received my letter, he would sit down and pen a lengthy reply, which was a tremendous aid, not only to my historical research, but also to my morale. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so he carried me through that dissertation process with magnificent generosity. But also he was inculcating into me the mind of a generalist. Your topic may be of interest, you may have some good things to say about French policy toward the Weimar Republic, but always expand your mind and keep in mind the larger issues of international politics or whatever it is you're writing about that for which your topic is relevant. So I credit William McNeill for shaping the kind of historian I became.
Well, that's not a bad tree to be coaching tree to be a part of, right? Well, and that feeds into the question that I wanted to ask is, how would you describe the state of history teaching and research today in the academy? What do you think?
History, academic history.
Yeah.
Is on life support. It has been dying, literally dying, for 17 years. It began with the financial crash of 2008, the subprime mortgage financial crash. Mm-hmm. Because students beginning, you can just date it precisely, beginning that year, began to flee from the humanities and social sciences. History, when I first came to Penn, was, I think, the second largest major in the college, right, behind English. English and history. Now, history has fallen. Let's put it this way. History used to have about 300 majors.
Right.
It is now, when I went to the graduation ceremony the other day, history was down to about 30.
Really?
Enrollments have plummeted. And new, more kind of career relevant majors have become the most popular among students today. That's one cause, economics and student insecurity about their future careers. But another is the fact that the history faculty who used to teach large lecture courses such as ours and draw scores or even hundreds of students into the history major, they're almost all gone. Penn used to have the second most prestigious faculty in international relations and political history, second only to Yale. Now, all of my colleagues that I used to have here early in my days, in my years at Penn, they've all retired, died, or not gotten tenure. And none of them has been replaced. Not one. We had some of the most dynamic professors who taught courses on war and diplomacy, Nazi Germany, international relations of one kind or another. We had Jonathan Steinberg, the great British-born scholar who worked on Anglo-German relations and naval history. Arthur Waldron, who was a very prestigious professor of Chinese history and who taught courses on strategy and war and technology, which drew hundreds of students. They've all either died, retired, or not gotten tenure, and not one has been replaced by my benighted colleagues. Why? Oh, diplomatic history, military history, political history. That's old-fashioned. That's old-fashioned history. Now we're into trendy fields: cultural history, feminist history, gay history, courses such as the gendering of graveyards in 17th century France. Imagine if you were an undergraduate, especially if you were a boy, looking at history courses, hoping to find courses on American politics or the origins of the First World War, courses that were that used to be absolute mainstream required courses. They don't exist anymore, and of course, we don't have the faculty anymore to offer them. One reason I'm still teaching full-time at 78 is that I direct the international relations program at Penn, and the IR majors need to take courses on American, European, and Asia-Pacific international relations. They need to know this stuff. And I teach now exclusively big lecture courses. I haven't taught a seminar in about 12 or 14 years. I can't afford to, because I need to offer the lecture courses that IR majors and the dwindling cohort of European or diplomatic history majors need to take.
See, this is a paradox, right? Is that the interest in historical topics is out there. Yeah. It's out there among the students. It's out there among the public too, right?
The market is still there.
Yeah.
If you follow the New York Times bestseller list, you will see that the history titles on the bestseller lists are almost exclusively biography on the one hand. It's always popular,
right?
And political and diplomatic and military history on the other hand. Also, undergraduate students, girls as well as boys, still are very interested in taking courses on political, military, and diplomatic history. It's just that we don't offer them anymore. We're now, as I say, we used to have about a dozen very prestigious and popular historians in those fields. We're now down to just 2 Europeanists, both of whom specialize in Russian history, 1 Americanist, moi, and 1 Japanese expert, a professor who teaches modern Japan and East Asian international relations. They're the only ones that are left. What can be done about this? Nothing, I'm afraid. Nothing. Because the postmodern deconstructionists and feminists, who back when I began teaching were insurgent outsiders trying to get their fields recognized as legitimate. And I understand that, and I appreciate their efforts, but they've long since now captured the commanding heights in the Ivy League schools and other prestigious universities like Cal and Stanford. They've taken over now. They are the establishment. uh, and they hire their own.
Oh. Well, which gets us back to this particular book and the idea of identifying events, historical developments, wars, and trying to find a way to both deal with the details of the stories, but in a way that relates them to a larger theme. One essay I'd like to mention is your essay on the War of 1812.
Oh,
right. Because
good.
I feel like, right, I mean, even the title that you selected for that essay is the grand strategic consequences of the allegedly foolish War of 1812. And with we won't necessarily belabor the point of the war, but the idea of being able to take something that people think they know and make the familiar unfamiliar and draw out its significance. What would the history of the United States be like if we hadn't fought the War of 1812, Walter?
Well, who knows? But first of all, it's quite likely that Great Britain would be our Western neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
The British government, the most powerful government in the world at the time, had never recognized the legality of the Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of the French, had kind of coerced the King of Spain into retroceding the Louisiana Territory back to France.
Mm-hmm.
And Napoleon had conjured the idea during a brief truce in the Napoleonic Wars of sending an army over to the Caribbean and reoccupying Louisiana, especially New Orleans, and colonizing the entire Mississippi River and Missouri River basins. Incredible. Most Americans, even historians, don't even know these amazing events ever occurred. But Thomas Jefferson, who was in the White House at the time, wrote it down. He said, "This affair of Louisiana," he called it, "chills me to the bone." Imagine having Napoleon Bonaparte as your neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
And so Jefferson sent James Monroe, the Secretary of State, over to Paris in hopes of being able to do a deal, kind of a Donald Trump deal, and purchase at least the port of New Orleans from the French. And Napoleon, because his plans for Louisiana had backfired and the war in Europe had resumed, decided to, in fact, sell not just New Orleans but the entire Louisiana territory to the American government. And so the Americans in 1803 had acquired titular rights to the Louisiana Purchase. But again, the British government had never recognized the legality of this. As far as the British were concerned, the United States was the receiver of stolen goods.
So does that make
and
Napoleon
in the
the
War
fence?
of 1812, one of the principal British war aims was to take the Louisiana Territory back, take it out of American hands, and not either give it back to Spain or else hold on to the territory itself. And the Battle of New Orleans, which infamously was fought several weeks after a peace treaty had been signed between the Americans and the British over in Ghent, Belgium. People say, well, why was this battle fought? The war was over. The peace had been signed. Well, first of all, in those days, it took at least 2 weeks for news to get across the Atlantic Ocean. So the news of this peace treaty had not yet arrived in America. And meanwhile, the British had launched a major offensive in the Caribbean, sending a fleet and an army to invade New Orleans and to seize the Louisiana Purchase. And that was the battle in which militia commander Andrew Jackson and his mostly volunteer army had bravely stood up to the British invaders and defeated the Redcoats at the Battle of New Orleans. And throughout ever since then, historians have sort of posed the question: what was the War of 1812 about anyway?
Mm-hmm.
And why? And what's this Battle of New Orleans? What was that all about? It should never have happened. Well, the fact is that the British documents have now revealed uh, very suggestive evidence, most of which is circumstantial, but it adds up to and the personalities of the people involved too. The British Minister of War, the Foreign Secretary, they were all hawkish toward the states, and there's virtually no doubt that yes, the British had signed a peace with the United States, but had not yet been ratified by either government. And if the news had come back across the ocean that the British had won the Battle of New Orleans, that Treaty of Ghent might have been annulled by the British.
Mm-hmm.
So the war, in fact, had huge strategic consequences. The War of 1812 was also the occasion when William Henry Harrison, known as Old Tippecanoe, the commander of the Indian Fighting America militia in the Northwest Territory, Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan, and Andrew Jackson, the militia commander from Tennessee, leading American militias in places like Horseshoe Bend, Alabama, Mississippi, and then ultimately down into Louisiana. They defeated hostile Indian tribes, very powerful confederations of hostile Indian tribes, all of whom had been armed by the British. And so the expansion of American civilization east of the Mississippi, and also west of the Mississippi, was made possible by the otherwise irrelevant War of 1812.
To understand that greater geopolitical significance, it throws everything into a different light. So I want to invite the audience to feel free to use the Q&A feature to pose questions. And Fritz Heinzen asks, have you, Professor McDougall, ever found material in an archive or read a book that so supported or contradicted one of your earlier works that you wish you could go back and rewrite that earlier work?
No. I worried about my History of the Space Age book because I wrote that in the early 80s,
right,
when many of the documents concerning the Soviet-American space race back in the 50s and early 60s had not yet been declassified. I did all the research I could at the NASA History Office and at the National Archives, and then I toured the presidential libraries, Kennedy, Eisenhower, and Truman and Lyndon Johnson libraries, and did as much research as I could there. And I actually applied for a number of the key documents to be declassified, and I was able to get many of them declassified. But even the important documents that were declassified were often redacted. In other words, you'd get a Xerox back, or whatever it was, whatever the technology was back in the day. I guess they had Xerox machines, copier machines of one kind or another, and the National Archives would send me these documents. Congratulations, we have your request that these documents be declassified it has been approved, and here they are. Whole paragraphs would be blacked out in these documents, because of course, space technology in general and the competition with the Soviets in particular were extremely delicate issues, and this was still during the Cold War, it's the 1980s, right. And so I had to kind of intuit from the rest of the document what was probably written in those redacted portions of all these documents. And most of them had to do with spy satellites, reconnaissance satellites.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The United States of America lost, quote unquote, the first space race to the Soviet Union with the Soviet launch of the Sputnik 1 satellite in 1957 because the Eisenhower administration was obsessing about reconnaissance satellites. That is why the United States, quote, lost, unquote, the initial race for space. Why? Was the United States behind the Soviet Union in rocketeering and building large missiles? No. We got the von Braun rocket team. We got the German rocket team that had built the V-2 rocket for Adolf Hitler. They were working for the United States Army down in Huntsville, Alabama at the Redstone Army base. And they would have been capable of launching a satellite into Earth orbit at the very day one of the International Geophysical Year that was declared in 1956 to promote international cooperation on such topics as as outer space, Antarctica, oceanography, and the von Braun rocket team had built a rocket more than capable of launching a satellite into Earth orbit. It was forbidden to use this rocket because it was a military rocket, and Eisenhower didn't want to have a military program launch the first satellite out of the fear that the Soviet Union would now denounce the American satellite and indeed satellite overflight in general as being illegal under international law. At that time, international air law was based on the Chicago Code that was written by an international committee in 1944. Under the Chicago Code, the sovereignty over the atmosphere was said to extend from the boundaries of a country usque ad caelum. Usque ad caelum, even unto the heavens. Right. So there was no upper limit to air rights, and so if you launched a satellite as it was circling the Earth, it could certainly be argued that you were violating the airspace of a dozen other countries. And so the only way to establish the right of a nation to launch any satellite, but especially a reconnaissance satellite, was to let the Soviets do it first.
I have to say, this is the one, you are the only person, or let's say the first person I've heard to make this argument. And the only that so often when Sputnik is brought up, right, people talk about this, it was an embarrassment for the United States. It showed we were too busy putting tail fins on our cars or whatever it is we were doing. The idea that there might have been a strategic reason to let the Soviets do it, because if we didn't complain about it violating our airspace, they couldn't very well turn around and complain.
Exactly right. Exactly. Now, the book was very successful. Of course, it won the Pulitzer Prize, and I became known as kind of the dean of space age historians. But I always was worried whether I had gotten something wrong. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Whether my inferences from these documents had gone too far, or whether I had argued this case too strongly. Well, of course, there's been a whole shelf of books that have been produced on the early space age since that time, especially since the end of the Cold War, because the Soviet story has now become fully known by many historians, most of them working at the Smithsonian. And I am proud to say that nothing in my book has ever been refuted. That is a very it's a feather in my cap, but one I don't entirely deserve. I've just been very fortunate.
Well, it's like, getting it right early is a good thing. So we have a question in from Mark Risk, that I think is a good one to wrestle with, and that is two distinguished historians have announced in a very public way that they're leaving Yale to go to the University of Toronto. They appear to be relying heavily on their knowledge of history in asserting that the current U.S. administration is a serious threat to a liberal democratic political order. How do you think that the serious study of history should inform us in this tense political moment? Does a historian have anything unique to add to the conversation? How should we, and to add to that, right? How should we proceed with historical analogies?
It is ever thus.
It is ever thus.
It is ever thus. The political scene in the United States of America has been rough and tumble with alleged threats to democracy made by the opponents of whoever is in power ever since at least the late 1790s. Mm-hmm. George Washington was unanimously elected, and he was bipartisan or nonpartisan, and the country was fairly well united under Washington. But as soon as the feud began, as soon as the political party system began, which Thomas Jefferson is responsible for, and plus Alexander Hamilton, the country has been divided. The first party system was the Democratic Republican Party under Jefferson and the Federalist Party under Alexander Hamilton and President John Adams. And the election campaign of the year 1800 was ugly beyond description. Accusations of the most vile sort were exchanged. The election ended up getting thrown into the House of Representatives because no one had a majority in the Electoral College, and it was brutal. And American politics have remained ugly for most of our history ever since. The fact that Donald Trump is a, quote, threat to the republic or a threat to democracy, unquote, is no more true or shocking than the people who said that Franklin Roosevelt was a threat to our democracy.
Or Andrew Jackson.
Or Andrew Jackson, exactly right. Or for that matter, the Southern politicians in the run-up to the Civil War. Wow. And we've had political assassinations, of course, on several occasions in this country. Now, Donald Trump is certainly a unique personality. Everyone's unique, obviously, but Trump is really kind of off the charts in terms of his personality. The only politician that I would cite as a kind of a forerunner, well, there are two to Donald Trump, are Wendell Willkie, the Republican presidential candidate in 1940, and Ross Perot, the independent candidate in 1992, because they also were businessmen. Mm-hmm. They lived their entire careers had been spent in the business world, and then they just decided to jump into politics, and certainly that's what Trump did. But Trump has been, of course, wildly more successful than those other two businessmen, and he has, to a great degree, reshaped the Republican Party. Right. So when people say the democracy is dying, what they're really kind of remarking is that the Republican Party is no longer the Republican Party that we knew throughout our lifetime. And we're fearful about what this new MAGA Republican Party may do. Right.
Well, and the larger question of, we've gone through periods where there's always been some rough and tumble, there's always been ugliness, but there have been periods where that was sort of more and less the case. Right. When you look at, sort of in your constitutional history of U.S. foreign policy, in this book, you talk about the rise and fall of certain ideas. What is it that brings American politics or American foreign policy back to the mean? If these moments come where we go through these peaks of extremes, what is it that brings us back? And do past examples, going back to the War of 1812, you talk about, it's the War of 1812 that ushers in the era of good feelings, essentially puts an end to the Federalist Republican split.
It engendered the era of good feelings.
It engendered the era of good feelings.
The war years themselves, 1812 to January 1815, were extremely bitter, strife-filled years in American politics. The Madison administration was extremely unpopular with the still surviving Federalist Party, right, especially in New England.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1814,
seceded.
The New England states sent delegates to Hartford, Connecticut, to have a convention for the purpose of deciding whether or not to secede from the Union.
Yeah,
because their commerce had been utterly destroyed by Jimmy Madison's war, as they called it. Now, we must always remember that the American political system was established by the Constitutional Convention in 1787 to be a free market in power. A free market. The structures of government and the balance of power and the checks and balances among the three branches of government and between the federal government and the states, they were established, or some rules had been set up for the working of the free market in power. But as for the contents of that free market in power, it was up for grabs, totally up for grabs. The founding fathers, in their wisdom, I believe, basically said future generations of Americans are going to shape their own values. They're going to shape their own policies, and we're going to enable them to do it through the rule of law, indeed. But we're going to let the future generations of Americans adjust to their own times, meet the needs of their own times, and take this country where we hope God above intends it to go. And in fact, that brings to mind the theme, very important theme of my more recent books, called Civil Religion. America, like most countries throughout history, has indeed a civil religion, which is not exactly Protestant Christianity or Christianity in general, or for that matter, Judeo-Christianity or biblical religion. It derives in many respects from those biblical traditions, but there is a kind of heretical worship of self, which informs the culture, and particularly the political culture of this country. We are God's people. We pray, God bless America. We think that the world should look to our system as a kind of a model for their own system and for their own future. And we go into foreign conflicts, especially shooting wars, with utter confidence that God is on our side. And so when there's a very unpopular war, like the Vietnam War, this causes a crisis in the civil religion. But in good times, for instance, the 1920s or the 1990s, which most of us lived through. And remember now, whatever we thought of Bill and Hillary Clinton, we remember the 1990s as the best years of our lives. Best years of our lives. The country was prosperous beyond belief. The computer and IT revolutions were kicking into gear. We actually had a balanced federal budget for a couple of years in the 1990s. And militarily, the United States was enjoying utter hegemony. We had shown in the 1991 Gulf War, the first Gulf War, that the American military was invincible. And we wiped out Saddam Hussein's Iraqi forces with barely a casualty of our own. And the expectation was that the world would continue on this path. Globalization was kicking in, and everyone expected that it would never stop. Alas, it all began to come crashing down on 9/11.
9/11.
The history of the United States, both domestic policy and foreign policy, has been disastrous ever since 9/11. And you can blame that on George W. Bush, on Barack Obama, on Donald Trump, on Joe Biden, and now on Donald Trump again. All of the presidents of both political parties have allowed American foreign policy to run into sand or run into blood and sand in the case of George W. Bush. And all of those presidents have expanded the American federal deficit by orders of magnitude. Well, not orders of magnitude, but it's gone. The federal deficit has expanded from about $3 trillion before 9/11 to $36 trillion today.
And I guess
our country is in a perma crisis.
And that's the question: is what does it take? What can it take to redirect? Like you mentioned 9/11, you mentioned the 2008 economic crisis as important caesuras in modern history, and you can find them in the past. So we Americans, we look towards the future. We imagine that we're moving in some direction to whatever the events are that are going to change us. The old Herb Stein line, right? That the things that can't go on forever don't.
Right.
Yet the United States of America continues to go on, right? And I would say that one of the lessons to take away from your histories of the United States and from this collection of essays is things haven't always been great. Things sometimes get better, things sometimes get worse. The challenge for historians is to help to make the past intelligible, but unfortunately, it can't make the future completely visible because we have to live through it first. Walter McDougall, we are just about at the end of our hour. And I just want to say one more time, thank you for being with us. Thank you for all of your work for FPRI, your work for Penn. I encourage all of you to consider taking a look and getting you a copy of Gens of American History. It is available in bookstores now. FPRI has been enriched by Walter McDougall's contributions, and we look forward to having Walter McDougall at future events. I do have one announcement at the end of this program is, ladies and gentlemen, this is the final program of People, Politics, and Prose. After 12 years and about 100 episodes, the time's come for me to step away from the microphone. It's appropriate that the last program that I would do in this series would be with the man who brought me to FPRI in the first place. And I can think of no better way to go out. I remain a senior fellow at FPRI and will continue to make my contributions where I can. But it's time for me to do some other things. But I do look forward to seeing all of you, seeing you, Walter, and seeing all of you who are in the audience at future events. And of course, let you know what happens after this. To keep up with future events at FPRI, please visit our website, fpri.org. Like us on Facebook, follow us on X. You can follow the host of this program on X at Ronald Granieri. But at long last, for all of us at FPRI, I'm Ron Granieri. Goodbye, and thank you for joining us.